Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Arete Podcast. I'm joined today by a very, very special friend of mine, Dr. Peter Zisa, classical. Is it appropriate to call you a concert guitarist?
It is. I do quite a bit of concerts.
So
Um, yes.
classical, and I know that you play jazz as well, and I'm sure a myriad of other styles, but you'll have to forgive my basic passing knowledge of music. So I've got, what would you say? I've got high school level band
Ah,
uh,
well, that's good.
training. So that's that, but that's about the extent of it. So I'll probably ask some clarifying questions. But he was kind enough to join me tonight and tell you about why music matters. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Peter Zissa. And before we get into it, this podcast is brought to you by One Weekend at Horrorland and Revival Book One of the Unveiled book series. We will talk more about those later, but I will give the floor to you, Peter, to let everyone know who you are and what your story is.
Oh, I'll try not to talk too long here. Uh,
It's
I
kind of what
am
we do. It's kind of what we do. So talk as long as you like.
okay. Well, I'm going to take the path of how I got started in music in the first place. So, like many people who become musicians, you have to have a beginning, and it's a curious thing to me to learn how people begin their path in any endeavor, in particular, of course, music. For me, my father was a non-musician. He didn't play a musical instrument, but he loved music. I was surrounded by uh, a lot of jazz, and that style of music was something that I was very fond of. At one point, and I can remember vividly in the car, he said, "Son, uh, what would you like to play? Would you like to play a musical instrument?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds like a nice idea. Uh, well, what instrument would you like to play?" And I thought about it a moment. I said, "The violin." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, when I hear the violin, it just holds a note forever, and it's just, beautiful melody." So after that, I didn't hear anything, and then um, one day, my dad and my mother went to a friend's house, and we came home with a $10 harmony guitar. So I asked for a violin and I got a guitar. I asked for an instrument that can hold a note forever, and I got one that can hold a note for about 3 seconds. Uh, and I wondered, why he did such a thing, but he had his reasons, which he explained later. He thought that I might get discouraged that the instrument didn't sound very good. Of course, playing a $10 guitar and learning jazz from the very beginning, doing bar chords and diminished seventh chords at about the age of 8, I heard a lot of buzzing. And I can remember, though, that throughout the beginning years, I did love to play the guitar, although practicing is something that is never something that children like to do on their own. They have to be helped. So I was fortunate because my father, even though he didn't play an instrument, and even though he knew only what he heard and understood what he liked, was determined he was going to make sure that I had a variety of experiences in music. And so periodically, he would change teachers. And so I started with a jazz teacher who played in the bands, uh, then went to a violinist who didn't know anything about guitar, but taught me notes in first position. And then eventually found myself visiting different styles of music along the way. And at some point, I had a teacher that was the most, um, how do you put it? He was a person who had great integrity. A lot of teachers, we got to make money. So you got a student that's showing up and paying and looks enthused. You could have them on your chart for years. This teacher was very popular, apparently, and I responded to him very quickly. But within about 6 months to 8 months, something around there, he taught me fingerstyle, which I had rejected. I played with a flat pick all the way up to that point, and he convinced me I couldn't do these things, and I tried it and liked it. And his last lesson, he came in, he recorded 2 or 3 songs, and he said, I'll see you next week. Figure them out. He came back the next week. I had them all down within a day. A lot of varied picking styles and stuff he was demonstrating. And he said, I could teach you songs like this for the next 10 years, but I think you should consider going to someone that's even better at this style of music, or you might consider classical. So I had no clue what that meant in terms of classical. So I asked my dad, and he said, oh, I think it's something like Me and My Shadow, or Red Roses for a Blue Lady, or something like that. I knew those songs from the jazz era, but I thought, really? Is that? Well, found out as we both were educated, it wasn't that. So my coming to classical guitar was really not in the right way. And although he had recommended a teacher, I went to a flamenco guitar teacher first before realizing if I did want to study classical, I would need eventually to actually have a classical guitar teacher. So the within my early years, I'd say my early teens, I was already doing some performing, um, conservatories and things of that sort, sometimes at a church events, some solo pieces. And when I went into college, that was my goal, was to be a performer. And the education was something that helped. I went to Cal State Fullerton at that time in Los Angeles. There were 3 really strong guitar programs, and one of the very few at that time, because I think there were only a handful, less than 10. I remember years later, there was up to 50. Now, we're talking pretty much every college and university. But at that time, the guitar, you're playing with violinists and stuff. They're looking at a guitar like, you are um, not kosher. So anyway, I did well. I performed well. I entered some competitions, although I didn't particularly care for the idea that music was something competitive. To me, music was something that was individual, creative, and I was never really attracted to try to impress people, but wanting to see people receive something, a change of mood, lighten their spirit, give them the joy that I had in music. So I did enter a couple competitions and did well, but by and large, that was the road. And then eventually, of course, got my performance degrees and went and did some performing. And of course, after that, you find yourself in the teaching world. And I now live in Oregon, beautiful state, lots of trees. I love that. I was living in Orange County previous to that, and they seemed to be having a moratorium on any tree that was fully grown. So and when it hit like 95, and you'd be looking for a tree that you could park your car under. And so here I've taught at Pacific University, at George Fox, and in Marylhurst for close to 15 years, roughly, about that. And was the head of the guitar departments at these places. But by and large, I've always had an interest in a variety of music, and not perhaps because of my father, but also because I just really found music and culture and time to be really exciting. To visit other countries, I didn't imagine that I was going to get always the opportunity. So this was a way to do that. And so this is bringing full circle. Even when I was up here and teaching at the universities, I established concert at different places. So when I was at the community college, we had an experience music concert series that was connected to the World Music Program. And when I was at Merrillhurst, the World Voices Program, classical guitar series for guitarists who were touring. Um, and so after my father passed away, I thought, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm going to retire from this university thing. And I think I'd like to start a nonprofit. And we called it CDZ Collegium Musica. And our mission is to bring community together through music performance, education, and cultural exchange. And all three are really important. Uh, in recent years, because of the pandemic and my connection with so many musicians in Portland, but also traveling from throughout the country and at different parts of the world. So we've had artists from Japan and from Italy and Germany and Brazil and Argentina. So as well as Michigan, and New York, and Massachusetts, and so forth. So the idea of having the program as we came out of this pandemic be able to help musicians trying to restart, because for 2 years we were told we weren't necessary. So we had to go on YouTube and try to do things, which is how I got started. I think I got like a million, no, it's just maybe 200 videos that I put up on YouTube for instruction, a variety of things. But my gosh, I tell you, there are some people who didn't make it through, and some people who are no longer playing music at all, been really severely damaged. And but there are those who are brave going out there, restarting and doing great. And I'm real pleased that we've had a really great couple of years. So the idea of doing a podcast is to really help, not mostly to help the general public to be able to get to know things that they don't. I mean, like, I didn't know anything about classical music. And some people don't really know much about jazz. I mean, if I said um, a name of a couple jazz musicians who are very famous, well, in fact, 2 years ago, I was asked to teach some classes at Roosevelt High School for a summer program. 99% of the classes were Black. And I was told that as a teacher, I would teach them to play guitar, once or twice a week. And at the end, if they seemed to do pretty good, this organization called Free Guitars for Kids would give them that guitar. So it seemed like a great idea, good deal. I asked a couple of questions like, do you know who Bessie Smith was? No. How about Ella Fitzgerald? No. How about,
Really? Not Ella Fitzgerald?
nope. How about Louis Armstrong? No. How about Jimi Hendrix? No. They knew not, but when I got to Michael Jackson, they did know Michael Jackson.
A little bit more
They did
contemporary, yeah.
recognize, yes. So even among a population which you think that, if you're getting a music that they're getting that. Now the band teacher, he had all these pictures on the board, and most of the ones he had, because the Roosevelt High, mostly uh, African American students, and said that he realized, hey, that would be a good thing for them to know. But none of these students happened to be necessarily a part of that program. So they were outside that wall, and they don't know any of this style of music, which of course means that you are losing some of the heritage that, as American, and also cultural heritage, that how different cultures actually contribute, because we take for granted everything that's music today just has always been that way. But I just finished a video today. I may share it with you, so if you be interested. But I had not heard this little clip, but it was Richie Blackmore, who had played guitar for Deep Purple, again, a group that probably none of those kids would know. And a lot of kids nowadays may not know, but they would recognize at least a few of the songs. And in talking about one of his most famous songs with Smoke on the Water, he was pointing out that he was inspired by two things. One, that in the early tradition of music in the Middle Ages, they used parallel fourths, which have kind of a so if you can imagine that would be music to the Middle Ages in terms of, you recognize the melody, but you definitely know that that's not the intervals that you were expecting. You're expecting thirds.
I think your Zoom audio has a noise filter on it
Oh, yeah,
because the
probably.
the guitar is cutting out a bit.
Oh, but yeah, that's one of the drawbacks on Zoom. I usually don't do musical things on Zoom because that usually has that bit of a problem. But you can take my word for it.
I
The third
believe you.
the thirds sound like the music that you normally would hear, and the fourths uh, sound a little peculiar. But in the days of the Middle Ages, the tuning system didn't make thirds sounded out of tune, so they didn't like it. So the
Now
fourths,
is that because I've often wondered about that because again, this is probably my ignorance, but I have always been curious about that because I have heard some reproductions of medieval music, and I've always kind of wondered because it did sound slightly out of tune, which I don't have an ear, but if I think it sounds out of tune, it's probably out of tune because if I pick up on it, someone with a musical ear is probably like, "Oh, that's way off." But is is that because it was just less precise in terms of instrument making and everything was kind of varied, or is there another reason for that?
it bears to the aspect of science. So the system that they were using had dated back to the days of Pythagoras, which is like we're talking like 500 years before Christ. And for the people of the uh, Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, that was like brand new. Uh, Essentially, the fall of the Roman Empire was like an atomic bomb that destroyed all of civilization and all the knowledge that came before. Some scholars said that if Rome had survived, we would have landed a man on the moon by the year 1000. So it basically put us back 1,000 years in terms of development. And much of what we gained in terms of knowledge was a result of invasion. Today we would say the occupation. So the Moors, we were Arabs, had conquered Spain, and they stayed there for 800 years. I mean, we would call that a pretty extensive occupation. But what they brought were elements of math and architecture, which was not available to the people of the Middle Ages. When they kicked the Moors out around 1492, there had been an immense change. And part of that change was the result of science. Uh, we have Pythagoras, Archimedes, Aristotle. These were all new people, and of course, Roman mathematicians and philosophers, all of that. And so, by the time we call the Renaissance, the aspect of trying to figure out how they could create a better tuning system was a matter of science. But science was not developed at that point. We're hundreds of years before Galileo. So they were relying strictly on the writings of Pythagoras, and they believed everything. I mean, until Galileo in 1600, Aristotle was the person they look at. Well, Aristotle said this, so therefore it must be right because he was a Greek and he was blah, 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 blah. And even when he got things wrong, it wasn't until Galileo said, I don't think Aristotle was right. He was wrong here, 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 and here. And due to, in part, things like that made a big change. So we won't go a history lesson here, but all to say, throughout centuries and because of wars And because of conquest and occupation and changes, the development of a tuning system that we now consider ours is a result of a long progression of that. And in fact, it wasn't until the 19th or 20th century that we can say that this aspect of equal temperament, the way that we uh, claim that we've got it right. Not everyone would agree, but that tuning system becomes kind of uh, the standard. So the aspect of right around the 1470s, we really see the shifting from fourths to thirds, and we didn't look back after that.
I
Uh,
was gonna say that would have been well, and I could be wrong here, but I would assume that's before the time of what we would consider the classical era really began to boom, because but I
yeah,
mean, it led into it, obviously.
yeah. And this is again the beauty of scholarship today. We've got people who now have figured out what the music of the Greeks probably sounded like and can create that even as far back as the Egyptians. There were some types of notation they've been able to kind of decipher. It's really amazing, cool to see and hear music that you realize you might see an object, but it doesn't really speak to you. But music, suddenly you feel like you're in real time. It hits you very differently. So even when it's a little bit peculiar to your ear, but that's been the case throughout history, is this aspect of how cultural exchange in music is the way we live. I mean, everything we do, we can look and say, well, that's been influenced by this and that, so forth. The reason I brought up that particular song, Smoke on the Water, is because the composer of that says, most guitarists play it incorrectly. They play what we call power chords, which are parallel fifths. But he, hearkened to that when he came up with the idea. He had two points of inspiration. One was he wanted parallel fourths. And so the whole piece is in parallel fourths, which I kind of demonstrated, but didn't tell people, until the very end of the video. But and it's peculiar because I hadn't really thought about it at that time. And then the other thing that influenced him was the opening part. He changed the order of the notes, and he made it. Got a point of inspiration from Beethoven's Fifth. So if you put those two together, you get Smoke on the Water. Well, not exactly right, but those were a catalyst to that. So things that are old sometimes come back, and he certainly wasn't the first to use parallel fourths. We see fourths like that in modern 20th century music. It's just that they're harmonized differently, so we respond to them differently. Chuck Berry used parallel fourths when you did all of those little slides. But those were all parallel fourths. So yeah, I think that the the aspect of culture exchange and seeing how music evolves and helping people with the educational part to understand some of that, but mostly experiencing the music and learning a little bit along the way. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, most definitely. When I was, well, and to this day, when I was in high school, I had a bit of a knack for having a lot of multicultural music on my playlist. Now, this usually extended to lyrics, but even some of the compositions are different across the world. And particularly in high school, people would always ask me, they'd say, well, why do you listen to this if you don't understand it? And I'd always say, well, first of all, I want to understand it, and I'm a bit of a language nerd, so you know, if I had German rock on my podcast, I would learn the lyrics, and then when I learned what the lyrics were and how they translated and the plays on words, the song would get that much better. But then even songs that I didn't understand, like there's a beautiful song on my playlist that I discovered by complete accident. It's completely in Hindi. I don't speak a word of Hindi. I don't understand it, but I can probably tell you what the song is about based on the musical composition and the fact that it's a duet. But it's a beautiful song. Don't understand a lick of it, but You're right. Music is very much that universal language that you may not speak the same language, but you can still understand what a piece of music is trying to get at. And I don't understand how it works, but I'm sure you do. How it affects the brain and how certain structures of music compute differently.
Yes, I think that we our musical tastes and our backgrounds uh, change with each generation, and sometimes it's something outside of that experience that make a big change. Like in in the 50s and 60s, the single was the most important way to have a big hit. And so the single had to be roughly about 3 minutes. Anything more than 3 minutes is probably not going to get played. And then in the 1970s, this thing called FM radio comes out. And suddenly there are stations that will play a piece of music that might last 7, 8 minutes long. And so we have rock groups which are changing and creating this very long thing. And now I'm doing videos sometimes which are for YouTube, and the I'm laughing because to me it seems almost absurd, but I've got 1 minute. The idea is that you have to come up with something that's going to be 1 minute long, and you don't want to go beyond about a minute because it's a short,
Hmm.
and uh, and people are watching these things one short after another, short, 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 short.
Yeah, and believe it or
Uh,
not, they say the sweet spot for a short is anywhere between 20 and 35 seconds.
yep, I believe it. They're looking for if you lose them in the first part, it may not make it to the end. Yeah, I think there's too much sometimes of certain things. Yeah, but the info that I just shared with you though was a short. It was maybe like 1 minute that he was speaking about what inspired him to write "Smoke on the Water." So I was surprised, impressed, and surprised.
So did you ever learn to play the violin or is it strictly guitar?
Oh, I at some point decided that I would try to do that. It was like I was the junior high, but it was a really weird experience because it was a high school, junior high summer program. So the teacher came in, gave me a violin, and that was the instruction. Then they had a concert at the end. He gave me music. And he said, if you don't know the music well enough, just pretend. I said, like hell, I'm gonna make as much noise as I can because I practice this thing, and if I make a mistake, you didn't give me any time.
Yeah, violin is one of those instruments that I think would be kind of hard to fake it just by the nature of how you play it. And I chuckled a bit when you said you wanted to play the violin and you ended up with a guitar because believe it, uh, I think it must have been about 5 or 6 years ago. I just decided, I love the violin as an instrument, and I just decided I think I want to learn how to play this thing because I played brass instruments when I was in school, so I can read music, but I'd never played a stringed instrument ever in my life. But I love the violin so much, and at the end of my first lesson, I realized that I love listening to the violin, but I hated playing it. But I stuck with it for a while. I actually stuck with it until my violin broke, and I actually took it as a sign. Well, I don't think this is going to work out. So I have a loving respect for the violin, and I love to listen to it, but I don't have a desire to play it. It's way outside of my wheelhouse. But it's also funny because my violin teacher was a classical guitar player who could play the violin as well, but his big thing was guitar. And the only reason he was teaching violin lessons is because there weren't enough people at the school that wanted to play guitar to fill up all of his slots. So he told him, he said, "Well, I play violin too." So he would often use his guitar though to demonstrate um, certain, not necessarily technique, obviously, because it's a different instrument. But I did get a kick out of one day when he took my violin and played it like a guitar, just being fun. But I was like, oh, that's really interesting because if you think about it, as far as how the instrument is constructed, it is just kind of like a really small guitar with a bridge or a different kind of bridge, I should say. But I got a kick out of that. So when you said that you wanted to play violin and you ended up with guitar, I was like, that's oddly reminiscent of what I had to go through. I did better than I thought I would, but yeah, the violin was not in my future, unfortunately.
I think that a lot of times when we have an instrument that we're attracted to, it is because of the quality of the instrument. It kind of reflects our personality. We would, I remember university students would comment on the typical personality of a tuba player versus someone who played the oboe. Of course, everyone hated the violinist, first violinist especially. Viola was okay. Cello was cool. So different, it's your spiritual voice, really. I mean, you're looking for for the magic, uh, what is it, the glass slippers kind of thing with the music. And some people, they have an attraction to a variety of instruments, and then that's the case. I think if I had been so inclined, that would have been okay, but I came to a point where I just thought that I need to invest in one thing and do it well rather than uh, be mediocre at three or four things. Although Paganini was reportedly a fine guitarist, he started on guitar. His dad said, "You got to learn to play the violin because that's where the big money is." And he was right. He he definitely made a mark in the world as a violinist.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I'm curious. What would you say is the or what would they say is the personality of a tuba player? Because I started at trumpet and I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. I was mediocre at best as a trumpet player. And then what year would that have been? It was my freshman or sophomore year. I can't remember. But anyway, long story short, our we had a small band, so we had one baritone player, and he graduated. And our band director really wanted a tuba instead of a baritone. And she came to me one day and she said, "Hey, would you be interested in playing the tuba?" And I said, I mean, I never really thought about it, but I mean, it can't be that different. It's a lot different." But
Yeah.
I enjoyed playing the tuba, but it was kind of by that point I was kind of losing not losing interest in music, but losing interest in being in the high school band. But I got a kick out of being the only tuba player. But what would they say is the personality of a tuba player?
Well, as I recall, most of the tuba players I knew had were bright and had a good sense of humor. The trumpet players were usually the ones that were the jokesters. That's what I would hear. They would be mumbling something, and the other brass players would laugh. So I didn't play in the band, obviously, because guitar wasn't a band instrument, but those are the rumors I remember overhearing.
That tracks, honestly. I'm not gonna lie to you. That makes a lot of sense. I really do wish if I had a regret in terms of being in the band, because you said some people are attracted to different instruments, and what I do regret, because I'd say probably my three favorite instruments to listen to are probably violin, various forms of flute, and then I'm a sucker for an oboe solo. I don't know
Mm,
why.
yeah.
There's a song. It's part of the soundtrack for one of my favorite movies. The movie is Princess Mononoke, and it's basically like the main musical theme, The Legend of Ashitaka. And in the full song, you don't really hear it in the movie, but in that full song, there's this gorgeous oboe solo where they basically crescendo and then fade out into silence for like probably longer than most American musicians would be comfortable with. And then it just goes into this very subtle, just beautiful oboe solo. It's so gorgeous to listen to. And I picked it up that it was an oboe right away because again, I have an appreciation for the oboe and I regret not playing one of those three instruments in high school. I think I probably would have had a much more enjoyable time in band had I gone with one of those, but I don't know why I didn't, honestly. I don't think violin was an option, and I probably didn't know what an oboe was at the time. And I was a boy in elementary school. There was no way in hell I was playing a flute. Like it wasn't going to happen. And I regret that, but it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, but I think that the oboe is a beautiful instrument. It's one of my favorites as well. Again, I think that if I look at my approach to guitar, I'm almost always thinking of it as if it was a violin in terms of melody. So I think that's the only connection there. But I do like, uh, yes, the flute. I end up working with two flutists. They're both really different personalities, but very accomplished musicians, but have different personalities in terms of a musical approach. So that's another great thing with playing with other people. Playing guitar, classical, for me was a long period that I did probably more solo things. And uh, but when I was in the university, I joined every opportunity I could to play with the Renaissance band, the string string ensemble, every ensemble I could get hooked up with, I wanted to be in. Yeah,
So do you
but
do you regularly play other instruments other than the guitar, or is the guitar your main
that's
focus?
my main focus. Um, I'll occasionally pick up the violin, occasionally fiddle on the piano, but it's kind of my same philosophy, although I can't say that it was the right thing to do. I had seen a lot of my friends who are musicians as I was graduating become infatuated with the new technology, which was um, the very first personal computers that were coming out. And did, I used it though to write my first guitar book when I was teaching at the community college in Los Angeles. And but I also did not want to become a computer nerd and find that I was spending all my time with the computer. So I said out loud and to myself, I will not learn any more than I have to. Uh, I don't know how a car works, but I know how to drive it. I don't know how a computer works, but I just want to use it for the things I need it for.
Well,
And
yeah,
sometimes
and
there's
there's
a disadvantage.
yeah, there's something to that though, because what you'll find, and just a quick aside on computers, you'll find that very early on in software development, they realized that the software engineers that were designing programs were not very good at designing them for the end user because it was all about efficiency of the program. So very quickly they realized, so for example, if you're creating a video editing software, you want input from people that are going to use the software, and they don't necessarily know how it works in terms of programming it, but there's something to that. But you want their input on how it should function, and then it's your job to figure out how to make it function that way. So there's absolutely, much as I would probably guess that there are people that, in the early days especially, that would make instruments that may not necessarily be able to play it well, but they would probably go to someone who could play it very well and be like, what should we do with this? You know, what changes can be made to optimize this for you to make it that much better? So there's something to that.
I agree. Yeah, I kind of wish that I knew a little bit more, and on occasion I will lament and say, well, maybe I should do a little bit more reading about uh, computer programming and things, something of that sort. Although I think that I've got some other things which take a higher priority,
Yeah,
which
we do live. I often find, I often describe myself as a victim of Faustian tragedy because there's so much I would love to know, but I understand not only is there a finite amount of time on in this world, but also there is a limit to brain capacity. And I lament that I will not be able to learn everything I would ever want to know, but I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try very hard. We're gonna take a quick break, and we're gonna talk about one of our sponsors, that being One Weekend at Horrorland, the Goosebumps and Horror Convention that is being put on by our friends and fellow Arete Podcast Pantheon members, the Goosebumps crew. And without further ado, Cal Dodd, who is one of the confirmed guests at that event, has something to share with you.
Hi, folks. My name is Cal Dodd, and I voice Slappy from Goosebumps, the TV series, and Wolverine. I will be attending an event entitled One Weekend at Horrorland, but only if we're funded by July 30th. So please get your tickets or pledge to the Kickstarter today, bub. Come on, we need your help to make this very special, spooky weekend happen. Tim Jacobus, the original illustrator for Goosebumps, the series, will be there as well.
And Slappy loves Tim.
You don't want to miss this, bub. If you do, I will hunt you down.
And Slappy will make you his slave.
Come on.
There you have it. If you don't show up to One Weekend at Horrorland, Wolverine will hunt you down. You heard it from the man himself. I gotta admit, I laughed really hard as a kid that grew up in the '90s and was obsessed with the X-Men. I laughed so hard watching Hal Dodd say that in Wolverine's voice. But anyway, um, the other purpose of this podcast with you is that we are going to announce that you also have joined the Arete Podcast Pantheon, and you will be releasing your own podcast in the near future. Please tell us a little bit about Musica Clasica.
Well, the purpose of the podcast is to help introduce some great musicians and to introduce music that people may not have heard before. Being a classical guitarist, a lot of my interviews will be probably more with guitar. In fact, I think that the very first set are guitarists from very different backgrounds and different locations. So we have one guitarist, Cinzia Milani, who is a winner of, I think, 14, 15 international competitions, and she's been performing for years. She did a debut concert here in Portland, and we arranged the nonprofit that I have, the CDC Kaleki Musica, arranged a series of concerts. So when an artist comes through, our budget is not like some other organizations which have a lot of money and resources. We're making improvement in that area. So what we offer instead is a multitude of opportunities to connect with the public and help with their promotion. And so some of that will be part of the interviews. But what I find interesting, and I think the public will find interesting, is how these different musicians became exposed to music and their path. They all come from very different backgrounds. Like there's a Japanese guitarist, and he came from Kyoto, Japan, and his father did play, I think, guitar, and he was a young child, so he wanted to learn to play an instrument, and so his dad gave him a banjo. Now, a banjo in Japan, the closest instrument would be shamisen, which
And
is kind of a
I was just thinking that when you said banjo, I chuckled initially, but then I thought, well, that's actually not. I didn't know the name of the instrument, or at least I didn't remember. But I said, well, that's probably not too far off. So
Well, his is a very interesting story, how he comes to the point of learning first on this banjo, And then he develops, and he has some significant teachers and support from his family. And then his teacher recommends that he goes to Berkeley. So he ends up getting a full scholarship to Berkeley, and his progress there and the changes that develop there um, contribute to not only a whole life change, because he now lives in New York with his family and children, uh, but also a whole different viewpoint of composition. He's got his own style of music. He's a very fine composer. A lot of the pieces are instrumental, but some are vocal. And so we'll have some of that kind of included in there. So you get to really know him. I Almost all the performers we have, I can't really think of anyone that would be an exception, are really interesting people to get to know, and their journey. Uh, we had one who I kind of consider him like the rock star of classical guitar. He has a picture of himself with the guitar, like he's playing, like he's a rock star. Uh, and he is always looking for new music. He's always looking to connect with composers and publish things that are going to be on the cutting edge. Even though he plays some traditional repertoire, he doesn't want to be defined by that. He wants to find other ways to be able to make himself meaningful in terms of the progress and the future of music. And we haven't there'll be other people that I will interview that I've met over the years, and those who I look forward to meeting. But sometimes the language barrier is an issue. We've got one such person in Russia, but many of the peoples do speak enough English that we can get by. So yes, it'll be an interesting experience, I think, for the public, because you'll hear music from different parts of the world, and people who are really finding their own path. So if you like to know what people's stories are and interesting people, you'll find that you'll probably want to follow their music. At the very least, you'll find that you'll feel better at the end.
Yeah, we've had a couple of conversations about what this podcast is going to look like, how it's going to be structured, and I've got to tell you, you heard me say it. I'm very excited for this because it is something that I would watch on my own, and the fact that I get to have a small part in helping to make that happen, I'm proud, happy, and excited all at the same time. So I'm very much looking forward to that podcast being released. Music, is it Classica Musica or music? It's Musica Clasica.
Musica
Yeah.
Classica.
We decided to go with the traditional, I guess it's not really sentence structure, but yeah, I guess it would be sentence structure of adjective after the noun. So the non-English sentence structure. And then I
I
actually,
we
oh,
I was going to say also there will be some elements that I'd like to be able to include, like we were talking about earlier, that have to do with um, increasing people's understanding. Because one of the big challenges for musicians from different musical styles that are very different is you've got to have something that helps the audience be able to understand what's going on. If you just suddenly say, okay, I'm going to take you to a shakuhachi performance, and there's nothing to educate you, you might be surprised what you hear. He said, gosh, I thought I was going to be hearing Roy Clark, but instead I'm hearing this person and I don't recognize that instrument. So it's some things that kind of help with that. And I think that's another really important part. And sometimes historical elements that help us understand why this music sounds different than this music. And there may be people who are actual musicians. It doesn't mean that you have to be a professional, but just simply interested in music, interested in the changes in music. And sometimes you find something from the past I was thinking about it. There are a variety of people that, if we take a look at it, throughout the years have changed the world, but they based some of their inspiration on other people that came before them. I mean, the Beatles with Little Richard and Buddy Holly. I mean, we wouldn't have heard the Beatles the same way if they hadn't had, those influences. And when you hear that and you listen to their music, you can say, oh, that's what they were doing there when they went up to that falsetto. They were imitating Little Richard. It wasn't just because they love you, yeah, yeah, yeah. That was Little Richard. That was their tribute to him. Or so we get that in music all the time. Cultural borrowing. Some people say it's stealing, but it's not. It's just
Well,
borrowing.
I don't remember who said it, but something to the effect of there are no more original ideas, only derivations and rip-offs and homages. That was the word I was trying to think of. So, but
Well, and usually when people haven't, take an idea out, the reason why you don't sometimes recognize it if they're really good at it, because I mean, if you had played, I never thought of uh, uh, parallel organum when I heard Smoke on the Waters. I certainly didn't hear Beethoven's Fifth, but being those two things were an influence, I have to take him at his word and realize that, yeah, if I looked at it, I could see how that could be the case. So sometimes an idea, but you borrowed, becomes something of a new creation in itself. Yep.
absolutely. Our good friend Kel Mazora just commented, music is the true therapy of life, which gotta agree with that one.
Yeah.
I do have a musical theory question for you, and I hope I ask it in the right way because it's something I don't know why I never asked it. Um, so when you're talking about music time, whether it be 3/4/4/4, what have you, at least all of my band directors would say the same thing when they were describing 4/4 time, for example. They would say 4 beats per measure, which I understood, and quarter note gets the beat. That's the part that I never fully understood, and it's probably a very elementary musical theory question, but I've honestly never understood it. So what does that mean when they say quarter note gets the beat?
Well, and maybe just the way that it was being told. So we have in music notation, and that system dates back, the beginnings of that system date back to the year roughly 1100. So the notation itself, writing a pitch on lines, this was something that was being done, and Guido d'Arezzo was the one that first came up with that. But rhythm was much more difficult. It took a long time to figure out how to write rhythms. So at some point in time, when we were looking at music, say in the time of Bach by the 1600s, we're seeing a fraction looking like symbol, a number on the top telling us in a given space of time, which we call a measure, there will be so many beats. So say there are 4, then you're going to tap your foot 4 times. And then underneath that, they needed a symbol that would represent the different types of notes which had a mathematical relationship. So it takes 4 quarters to equal a whole, 2 halves to equal a whole. And so if we look at 4/4 time and we say a quarter note equals 1 beat, then a half note will equal 2, a whole note will equal 4. And then those numbers that go smaller than that proportionally, an eighth, half a beat, a 16th, a quarter of a beat, and so forth. So it's an ingenious way. And yet at the same time, when you're in a band, precision is very important. Because if you're interpreting saying, I feel it like this, the band instructor is going to say, you are really messing up. But if you're doing a solo, that's what you want. You don't want the person to be making it too rigid. You want there to be more flexible. So more than likely, what they were trying to impress upon is watch the tempo, don't get ahead. There are going to be 4 of these, and anytime their hand came down straight like this, that was beat 1. Yeah.
So, but I guess the question would be, and this is the part that I really don't understand about it. Say, for example, 3/4 time. There's 3 beats per measure, but the quarter note still gets the beat. So I guess I don't understand what get the beat means.
Yeah. So in a measure, you're also having what we call stressed and unstressed beats. So if we were to say to count to 4, we probably would not say 1, 2, 3, 4. We would say 1, 2, 3, 4. And we'd instinctively be emphasizing 1 and 3. But if we say 1, 2, 3, we probably find ourselves saying 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So in general, we will hear people tell you that the first beat is strong and the third beat in 4/4 time is not quite as strong. When I was teaching music theory to students and had the same question, so how do I tell the difference um, between 2/4 time and 4/4 time? Because, they seem like they're the same. And I would tell them, well, 2/4 time is like honey, 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 honey. But 4/4 time is like peanut butter, peanut butter. So you're getting an accent on the third beat, but it's not bum, 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 bum. Yeah. So there is a difference between those two. Choosing the right meter is something that is an art form in itself. And sometimes composers, when they're writing a piece of music, have put some things in there to purposely make it more interesting and kind of go against what I just told you. Like if we're listening to an old Sinatra film and he's singing something and he's snapping his fingers, he's not snapping on 1 and 3. It's going to be 2 and 4. And we expect that in gospel music, and they're not going to be clapping on. You got the whole world. It's going to be whole world. It's going to be offbeat. And that's it's an interesting thing because if you look at some of those old vintage films like Chuck Berry performing before an entirely white audience on television, and they're clapping along. Same thing with Little Richard. You'll notice that half of them are clapping on the second and the fourth beat, and the other half are clapping on the first and third beat. You can see that there's a little bit of a cultural breakdown there.
Interesting. I'm not gonna lie, I still don't totally understand it, but it's one of those things where I knew that it was. You used the example of 2/4 time, because in my mind it's like, but it's just a fraction. How I didn't understand that. I knew it was different because otherwise they wouldn't do it. But I understand it more because it's basically down to the stressed beats.
Well, I'll give an example, and it's almost always notated incorrectly. So there's a song called When the Saints Go Marching In. Yeah. So usually it's written in the beginning guitar books in 4/4 time. Yeah. So you have a rest and then you have 3/4 notes into the next measure. So you have, oh, when the saints go marching in. But it's a marching song.
Yeah, it should be in 3/4 time, shouldn't it?
Well, not 3/4, but in 2. Because if you're counting it, oh, when the saints, now I can walk to that. And if you watch a New Orleans band, they're not doing, oh, when the saints. So the
Okay.
choice of meter is so very important. Because if you're telling them that they're supposed to, if you were doing it at the tempo, that would have been like allegro. And no one's walking at allegro at that tempo. They're practically running. They're late for the train. But if you're taking it at more the traditional tempo, you can imagine people walking. In fact, they use that song oftentimes. I suppose they still do in New Orleans when there's a funeral. They march with the marching band through the city, and they're holding the casket and they're moving it back and forth. Well, they're not going to be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So they definitely
Okay.
know that it's not in 4/4 time. It's in 2.
Okay. That actually makes sense to me now after all these years. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I figured you being a music educator, if anybody could help me understand it, it would be you, which actually is a topic we can talk about. I'm just curious here. I know that you obviously have a doctorate, but I also read that you've got, is it one master's or do you have multiple degrees other than the master's and the doctorate?
Got my master's in music performance, classical guitar, and went back to school to get a doctorate in education. I didn't specifically want to focus on music education. I wanted to focus on education in general. And it was, I wasn't sure initially whether it would be appropriate. Of course, I did my dissertation on something of a musical topic and related to music theory classes, and trying to make music a music theory class a more of an experience as opposed to some sort of challenge to see how much you could memorize in a term and forget shortly thereafter. So, and I think that's one of the things that I think that has drawn me to this aspect of the importance of music education and education in general, that we hear that music education is supposed to be important, but people don't know why it's important. And so they just presume it's some nice kind of nice hobby and give the kid to do something that hopefully they'll be able to do. And if they don't, then they just weren't talented. And that's the attitude. Whereas music, learning a musical instrument, we have found statistically, those students do better at school because they learn certain things that are important. Their study habits in becoming a musician require that they develop a good memory. And they do that by being able to consolidate and look for patterns to be able to memorize things. They also have to be disciplined. So they have to figure out and problem solve, not only fingering sometimes, but other types of things. So there's an intellectual part. You're learning a different language, a written language, as we were just discussing. And there's a stylistic language and a musical cultural languages. So it's a wealth of things, but I think especially for young people right around middle school and high school, even if they don't become musicians, I mean, because that's the goal of studying a musical instrument is to be able to play for yourself. Number one, I mean, if you decide that you're going to become a musician, then you have to, bear the cost of that, because not everyone's going to make a ton of money doing it. There's only a few people, and they're not necessarily the best. They just happen to be at the right place at the right time, and they've gotten a little bit of help along the way. But you are looking for music to be able to give something back to you. So sometimes kids are feeling, especially middle school and high school, that sense of isolation, that they're different, that they don't understand the world, and they have no way to be able to express it and to find themselves. So I think that in that part, when we will see a lot of money going to help elementary school, but that dries up sometimes when we get to middle school and high school. And I think that's when they need it the most. Even community college programs, sometimes difficult. So I think that the other part is music is about feelings. And when I played a piece of music, I want to know what's the composer trying to express. And those aspects of feeling what the composer is talking about, you're connecting with that. And it helps young people and old people as well develop kind of an emotional intelligence, to have a sense of empathy and compassion to others and understanding. And for those who are really frustrated and angry, well, goodness gracious, there's, I think plenty of examples of musicians, who really felt a therapeutic element of just being able to, in a very positive way, exude some of that anger and frustration in music. And people might say, oh, it was noise, but it was expression. And we can hear it in classical music as well. I mean, I think we all kind of get an idea that Beethoven was kind of a model in that way. Um, a lot of things occur in music gradually. It kind of evolves, gradual changes. But then there are pivotal people, and we can think of them in the 20th century as well, who change things because they just stand out. They make a statement, and everyone realizes that's a good way to go, and they pursue that. There's always going to be those kind of things that happen. So I think that kids to know that it's okay to feel those feelings, and music can be a way of going through that. And conversely, the same people can find a voice in being able to use music to calm their spirits. I taught at a university too, actually, that had a music therapy program. And that they also use music to, as in what we call an intervention, to be able to help kids who are with autism, or to have help people who are in hospice care to be able to deal with those last days in their family, or other types of illnesses, people suffering from dementia. Sometimes music will bring back memories. And some were examples of people who were essentially catatonic. You could talk to them and they just looked like they were limp. Suddenly they hear music and they come back for a moment. You can ask them, and says, yes, I remember that band. And it wasn't I had that experience myself when I was high school and early college. I'd go to retirement homes. They called them convalescent homes in those days. And I'd go from room to room. And one lady scared the hell out of me. She, she, I'm playing for her, and she'd just been like this. And I played, I think it was probably something like Meligania or something. And suddenly she said, I remember you in New York. I hadn't even been to New York, but suddenly she's pointing to me as a high school student and saying, I remember you in New York. I thought, in a different lifetime, maybe it was, I believe in reincarnation right now, this moment. It was a little terrifying, but I realize now, thinking back, it triggered a memory of something that happened to her. And suddenly, this person who hadn't spoken for more than, 2 months, that song, she was awake and
Yeah,
she talked. Yeah.
yeah. It's very interesting because to this day, and I'm sure everyone can relate to this, to this day, there are songs that I can hear and they'll take me back to because I rode the bus as a kid to school for the bulk of my, you know, elementary and high school years till I got a car at 17. So the bulk of it. There are songs that can come on to this day and it'll take me back to, being on that bus, hearing it for the first time and, liking it. And then other songs will take you back to, just various moments in your life. And it's so interesting because when that happens, it's clear as day. Like I can even remember some of the smells of when that happened. It's so interesting how the human brain functions, especially in relation to music. And Kelma just added patterns and frequencies enhancing the brain functions. And that's actually something that I know for a fact that's something that he is working on as well. Um, it's a very, very big project, and I'm not sure how much of it I can talk about, but I think I'm safe with that, Kelma. I think I can let him know that you're working on it. That's another thing. It's actually very, very fascinating work, and I'll be the first to admit I don't understand it, but he clearly does. And it does have to do with basically the human brain and how it reacts to stimuli, and music is one of those big stimuli that he's working with in that whole project. It's going to be very cool. It's probably going to be a few years before anything happens with it, but when it does, it's going to change the world. I have a pretty strong feeling that it will.
Great.
So you mentioned your nonprofit, but I guess my curiosity with that stems from how did that begin? And you kind of touched on what its goal is, but I'd like you to mo go a little bit more in depth if you would be so kind.
Sure. Well, um, as I had already said, I had been interested in having concert series at different locations and providing opportunities for other musicians because I knew how difficult it is to break in to the field. Um, when my father passed away uh, in 2015, I decided that I'd like to try to make a change and do something that would be a positive. And so we started a home concert series. And then that developed into, no, I think I want to make it into something that has specific mission. And that mission, as I mentioned, is to bring community together, bring people together from different cultures um, and different backgrounds to experience music performance and to uh, find this as an educational experience and an experience that will also coincide with cultural exchange. So that became the focus. The focus with the concert series, I realized to have a concert in one location is then it's just there in one place. So instead of doing that, I essentially, our organization holds these concerts at different venues. We bring the concerts to the venues for those specific areas of population. So I live in West Lynn, so there in this area here, there's a couple places that I use. I also know that I want to bring these programs to schools, so we look for elementary schools and for high schools and for community colleges and universities. So that's what we have actually accomplished quite a bit in being able to network with these other places where they might have a little budget, but we can add to the budget so that the musician can come, they can get a good pay for their work, and that they're the kind of musician that will be able to provide not only a great performance, but an educational experience that will, allow for an exchange of ideas. And these are musicians that are not necessarily all Western in terms of their background. And I don't know even when I say Western, it seems like it's a really uh, not a really very kind of a generic word to use because all of our music is so influenced by a variety of cultures. I mean, so, but we have musicians uh, from Brazil and from Argentina, so Latin America. We have musicians from Canada coming in this next month. But those three musicians we have coming in represent the places they came to Montreal. They all came from a different place. So I think that that's the other part of what we're trying to do and what we are doing is bringing programs that are interesting to experience and that you get introduced to new people, even within your community. We've had, guitar, sitar and guitar. Now, I never heard of anyone doing sitar and guitar. We've had sitar and tabla, but those are both Indian instruments. But sitar and guitar, I thought, oh, this will be curious, and it was great. But the guitars had a multitude of tunings to be able to do things that would complement, and they had worked it out between them as musicians, completely different backgrounds. And then there are the cultural components. But the concert, like I was mentioning that we're having next month, these three people, to me, that kind of summarizes what we're trying to do, because I think music has a healing force. It has an ability for people who we think are culturally a mixed match, who musically are coincide. They can actually be able not only to communicate, but produce harmonious sounds that are excitingly new and represent something bigger than the individual components. So if the audience is intrigued, we've got a fellow who is from Israel, but musically is more trained in music from Argentina. And we have a Palestinian who plays oud, which is an Arabic instrument without, kind of a guitar-like instrument without frets. Beautiful instrument. But again, the Argentine performer on Baduan is playing music like tangos. Okay, so imagine tangos and Persian music, or Palestinian music, Arabic music. And then we've got a percussionist who is going to be played daf, which is kind of a frame drum, and a tombak, which will be, again, different kind of music entirely. So the three of them have put together some pretty exciting things. I can share that with you, but we will hopefully be able to get interview. I know that one of the musicians I think will be available, and that would be an interesting thing. How these three musicians who met in Montreal, it's not like they knew each other before. They met, they're musicians. They said, "Hey, we're new here. What brings these three people together?" Which we would say none of them have anything in common, but they do. Music. So yeah.
Is there a way that people can get involved with that nonprofit if they would like to?
Yes, I mean I don't always push the fundraising elements as much. We rely on people to contribute. So we have a website, CDZ Collegium Musica, and it's .org. And we're a 501c3 organization. And like I said, we're bringing music to different venues, different populations, from children to high school to those who are retired, and even those who are infirmed. And our big events are sometimes, held at at universities and concert halls at different locations in the Portland area. Although we've extended to try to also help traveling musicians, those musicians who are on tour. I, as the president of the organization, I make calls and emails I send out to other friends I have contacted as far south as Ashland and even parts of California and Seattle, Washington. So try to see if we can be able to set up a tour for them. Otherwise, they have to do all of that on their own, and it can be really slow, hard, and impossible. And so anything we can do to be able to facilitate that, we try to do. Yeah. So we're
Excellent.
serving two populations, one, the musicians, and also the general public.
Excellent. Well, I've got one more very hard-hitting question for you. I'm gonna
Okay,
put
I'm
you
ready
in,
for it.
I'm gonna put you in the hot seat.
Uh-oh.
What is your favorite piece of music of all time?
Well, I'm obliged to say one thing, and I'm going to tell you the story first, but I'll try to be not too long. So my very first teacher was a jazz teacher. I was not what he was expecting because he had been a performer and he had only one other student. It must have been a very sweet girl. He was willing to build a guitar for that girl. He just loved her. Me, I think he realized he's going to be a challenge. He's not going to follow my rules. But I'll work with him because his father, Joe, has asked me to, and okay, I'll do it. And so he taught me several songs. And we came to the song called Besame Mucho. I said, I love this song. That's my favorite song. That's going to be my favorite song for the rest of my life. And he said, kid, there'll be other songs. I said, no, that's going to be my favorite song for the rest of my life. So you asked this question, I have to say Besame Mucho. But I do have to say that at the time I had no clue what Besame Mucho meant. I only knew that I liked the melody because it had expression and soul. And so as I played that song, I felt, you know, really connected. Years later, like 10 years later, maybe more, someone said, "Do you know what it means?" And they told me, and I said, "Really? Eh, eh, Lots of kisses." I would, as a kid of 8 years old, that would have been like the last thing I would have wanted to be associated with. But yeah. But there are many pieces of music I love. I love the music of Bach. I love South American music. I love jazz. And and I love the aspect of playing with other musicians. I didn't realize it when I was younger. As an only child, I played for myself, except for my friends. I have this one kid would come down the block and he'd knock on the door and he says, "You're practicing, okay? Good. Uh, I just want to listen to your music." Years later, like 50 years later, he tells me, "You don't know what depression I was feeling at that moment, and I needed to hear that. And your guitar just was so soothing." And nowadays I can look back, but I just thought it was because he was tired. He'd take his shoes off and his stinky socks, and I thought to myself, I don't know, but okay, he'd be sound asleep.
I mean, there is certainly power in music, as you're obviously well aware, and as many people know, and sometimes they don't even realize it. Well, Peter, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you very much for your time, your insight, and your knowledge. We are all looking forward to Musica Classica. I certainly
Thank you.
know I am. And you are free to come on this podcast anytime you wish. If you have anything you want to talk about or announce, just you've got my number. Feel free to give me a ring. You've got a open invite always.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I appreciate your time and inviting me, and hope that those who were tuned in um, will check us out online, CDZ Collegium Musica, or my personal website. But most importantly, I I really appreciate your support of what we're trying to do. I think it's important that the general public realize that music is something that can change a life. I like to end with one message, and it kind of ties in, and that is there was a young boy in so many years ago that his parents kind of abandoned him. He was living with his grandma. He got in frequent trouble with police. And one incident, he was shooting a BB gun. In those days, a BB gun still considered a pretty not such a good thing for a kid to be doing that just anywhere. And so they sent him to a camp as a result. And at that camp, he was introduced to the cornet. And that band director saved his life. And that young man grew to be Louis Armstrong. So music
Really.
matters. Music can change your life. And I think that having that opportunity where people don't have that opportunity, I think that we're shortchanging them. So on that note, I
That's that's
appreciate,
that's the best ending we could have possibly come up with to a podcast episode about music. So fantastic.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Peter. Everybody, check out his website, check out the nonprofit, and check out Musica Classica when it arrives. Trust me, we'll let you know when the first episode is going to premiere. And Peter, it was a pleasure. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Well, that was embarrassing. Something clearly wasn't set up right. You thought you were rid of me. Why is this thing? Oh, the things I do for an ad spot. I apologize, everyone. There we go. Ah, you thought you were rid of me, but we have one more sponsorship to talk about. And that is, of course, Revival, book one of the Unveiled series by personal friend of the podcast, Debbie Lynn. And I am stoked because I finally got back my signed copy. And I highly recommend, particularly if you are into fantasy or urban fantasy, you'll want to check out this book anyway. But I'm telling you, after having read it and knowing where the story is headed, this may very well be the next big film franchise. I'm not being hyperbolic. If the right people get a hold of this, they will turn it into the next, like I said, big film franchise. I loved the book as someone who's not particularly into urban fantasy. And you can check out the podcast episode we did with Debbie Lynn a couple of months back. It is on the channel there. And there is a link in the description to either buy your physical copy, which I highly recommend, or you can download the Kindle version if you're more of an e-reader type. But definitely check out book one because book two is on the way. So you'll definitely want to know what happened in book one so that you can jump right into book two. But anyway, sorry for the technical difficulties on that one. Thank you for enjoying the Arete podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe, and do support Peter in his music education, and look out for Musica Clasica